If I say to you, turn me down, if I say to you, tell me about your family, you're most likely going to tell me about your mate if you're married, your children if you have children, and if you have grandchildren, I will definitely hear about them. And you might talk about your parents and your siblings. In other parts of the world, if you ask people, tell me about your family, their response is likely to begin with their great-grandparents, and then their grandparents, and their parents and their kids, and so forth. And that's just kind of a cultural thing. Our family focus in Western culture might be a little more narrow than in other parts of the world, but nonetheless, I think we all realize this. We are who we are in large part because of our parents and other people in our family. And our parents are who they are in large part because of their parents and other members in their family, and so on down the line. We are who we are because of the people who came before us. And we, each one of us, we are a part of shaping the next generation by what we say and do. We all have stories about family members, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, etc. Stories that, whether we realize it or not, have had an impact on our lives, have shaped our lives. You are who you are today because of previous generations. And you are someone's previous generation. You're going to be a snapshot in someone's mind that has impacted their lives. Now, these two wonderful people on the screen are my pawpaw and mama Eccles, my mother's parents. My mama Eccles probably had the greatest influence on me becoming a preacher. So if you have any complaints about that, when you get to heaven, you can visit with her about that. My pawpaw Eccles, who died when I was 12 years old, nevertheless was very much an idol to me in a lot of respects. I idolized my pawpaw Eccles. But he was not a church-going man. And he was a peanut farmer, dry land peanut farmer, worked hard his whole life. And if you've never worked on putting a cultivator on a farm-all tractor, you really don't know what farming is all about. And it was very difficult, and sometimes he would let forth a little colorful language, and he didn't really care who was around. My pawpaw Eccles was very special to me, but I've thought, and I think I've probably mentioned this before, some of you have heard me say this before, I think I've thought many times about if my life would be different if my pawpaw Eccles had lived until my teen years and I had been a part of his life and he a part of mine into my teen years. The people in our lives so influence our lives. You are who you are because of the family that came before you. And the family who comes after you will be who they are, in part because of your influence. You are today, currently, making a mark on your church, on your future family. I mentioned at the beginning of this series that there really aren't many examples in Scripture that you could point to and say, I want my family to be just like that. If you want to get a picture of dysfunctional family, then just read the Old Testament. I think what you find when you read Scripture is that our families, for the most part, are just normal. They're just families. We have this picture of the ideal family, And often what makes a family ideal in our lives is it's not like mine. This morning I'm going to tell you a story that will be at least somewhat familiar to most of us. It's a story that covers some 60 years, and it illustrates the power of generational parenting and how important it is that we understand that each one of us influences the next generation. Now, I apologize for this diagram. It's a little bit fuzzy, but I hope you can read it. It was the best one that I could find, and I really didn't have time to make one of my own. So I hope that you can read this. This story begins with a man named Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were twins, and actually Esau was the one who was born first, so we really should say Esau and Jacob. Now, being the oldest son meant something different in that day than it means in our culture today. Being the oldest son, not the oldest child, because daughters did not have the same privileges that sons had. Being the oldest son meant that you were entitled to a double portion of the inheritance your father would leave upon his death. And being the oldest son also meant that you would become the authority figure in your family when your father died. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, one of whose name was Joseph. When Joseph was a teenager, his 10 older brothers, the 12th son, Benjamin, had not yet been born. Joseph's 10 older brothers hated him. Joseph was the son of his father's favorite wife. Now, there you go. This is why studying Bible families is challenging. In those days, men often had more than one wife at the same time. Now, foreign wife, our favorite wife, is a bit foreign to us. Someone today might say, well, you're my favorite ex-wife. And on second thought, that's probably never, ever been said. But anyway, Joseph is his father's favorite son. And if you're the favorite son, don't you tend to act like it? So you can imagine what his older brothers thought of him. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his 10 brothers. And as the favorite son, Joseph probably enjoyed tattling on his older brothers. So Joseph goes to check on his brothers, and they see him coming, and they're like, here comes that spoiled brother of ours who's always getting us in trouble with Father. And they actually said, let's just kill him. And one of the brothers, Reuben, said, we can't kill him. Let's just take his clothes and throw him in a hole. We'll smear some blood on his clothes and take him back to Father and tell him that a wild animal killed him. And so they took Joseph's clothes and threw him in a hole. But before they could leave him, they saw a caravan of merchants that were headed to Egypt. And they thought, hey, we can make a little money on this deal. So they sold Joseph to these merchants, and he's on his way to Egypt. See, just typical family stuff. I mean, who among us has not wanted to sell a younger sibling to, say, some other family sometime in our past? Here's a teenage boy, probably shackled, and walking behind a camel all the way to Egypt. Now, Joseph has grown up with servants, slaves, and he knows that his life, as he has known it, is over. And there's a pretty good chance he might not even survive the trip. But he does survive, and he was bought by a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard that protected Pharaoh, who was, of course, the ruler of Egypt. Now, we know enough about Joseph's time in Potiphar's house to learn this about him. Joseph determined to live his life believing God was with him, even though it appeared he was not. At every turn, we see Joseph doing the right thing, even though the right thing doesn't often happen to him. Joseph gained favor with his master Potiphar, but he also attracted the attention of Potiphar's wife. And one day, Mrs. Potiphar said to Joseph, "I want to have sex with you." And Joseph said, "I can't do that and dishonor my master, your husband. Hello, you're married." So Joseph told Mrs. Potiphar this as well. "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" You mean the God who allowed your brothers to sell you into slavery rather than killing you? You mean the brothers who stole your life from you? You mean that God? That's how a lot of people would look at that. But in spite of all he had experienced, Joseph was determined to do the right thing. Every day, Mrs. Potiphar propositioned Joseph. Every day, Joseph said no. And then one day, she grabbed him. And he pulled away from her, and he left behind his outer garment. Mrs. Potiphar accused Joseph of trying to rape her. And who's going to believe a slave over a woman of Mrs. Potiphar's status? So Joseph is thrown into prison. Now, it's bad to be a slave. And it's bad to be in prison. And it's really bad to be a slave in prison. If you're a slave in prison, you're not waiting for your public defender to come to discuss your case. You're not waiting for a court appearance where the judge is going to set your bail and a trial date. If you're a slave in prison, you're waiting for death, however long that takes. But even as a slave in prison, Joseph continued doing the right thing. And then we read this: while Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Now, if you're a slave in prison, if you are a God believer who's a slave in prison, you're not looking really to have a relationship with the prison warden. But because God was with Joseph in prison, the warden took a liking to him, and Joseph became the warden's right-hand man. And he did such a good job when he was put in charge of the prisoners, all that went on in the prison. He did such a good job that the warden could just, sit in his office all day and take credit for how good things were going. So as time goes on, a couple of guys from Pharaoh's palace get thrown into prison, and Joseph interprets dreams for them. And to make a long story just a little bit shorter, when these two guys got out of prison and Pharaoh has a dream that no one can interpret, they remember Joseph, and he's brought to Pharaoh, and Joseph interprets his dream. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that there's going to be a 7-year famine that will be preceded by 7 years of abundant harvest. Joseph has some suggestions about how to prepare for this coming famine. And Pharaoh puts Joseph, a guy who's not even an Egyptian, who is a slave and a convict, he puts Joseph in charge of storing food in preparation for the famine. And Joseph did such a great job that Pharaoh put him in charge of the entire country of Egypt. Only Pharaoh had more authority in Egypt than Joseph. Now we need to back up just a little bit. 2 years into the famine, Joseph's family ran out of food. And they heard that there was grain in Egypt. So Jacob sent 10 sons. Yes, the same 10 sons who sold their brother Joseph into slavery, he sent those 10 sons to Egypt to buy grain. And of course, since Joseph is in charge, his brothers appeared before him. And the scripture says that they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Remember that. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. I mean, it's been some 20 years. And Joseph's all decked out in Egyptian garb and so forth. And as his brothers are there prostrate before him, don't want to upset any of you guys. As his brothers are there prostrate before him, bowed before him, Joseph remembers. Perhaps he remembers good times with his brothers when he was much younger. But for sure, Joseph remembers the last time he saw his brothers. When he was shackled and headed to Egypt to live out his days as a slave. They forever changed his life, and now their fate is in his hands. But Joseph also remembered something else. A story. A story from his childhood. So let's rewind the story and connect the dots here. Remember, we have Abraham. We have his son Isaac. We have Isaac's twin boys, Esau and Jacob. Now, Esau and Jacob may have been twin brothers, but they were very, very different. Esau loved to hunt. He loved to be out in the wild. Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. The text says he liked to be around the tents. Isaac favored Esau, but the boy's mother, Rebekah, favored her son, Jacob. One day, Esau came in from hunting, and perhaps he had been out for a long time. He was famished. Jacob had cooked some stew, and Esau begged him for some of it. And Jacob said to Esau, his brother, "Sell me your birthright." Now, remember that Esau is the oldest, which, of course, carries with it great privilege. And Esau was so hungry that he agreed to hand over to his brother Jacob all of the privilege that was his because of that he was the oldest son. He sold all that for a bowl of stew. Now, fast forward several years, and Isaac is old. He has lost his sight. And it's time for him to pass along his blessing to his two sons. And the blessing was a legally binding agreement that would take effect upon the father's death. So, to make a long story a little bit shorter, Jacob, with the help of his mother, fooled his aging, blind father into thinking he was Esau. And Isaac gave Jacob the blessing that he had intended to give to Esau, his oldest. Jacob had unscrupulously stolen from his brother Esau everything of earthly value. And Esau was so angry that he determined that once his father died, he was going to kill Jacob. Jacob found out about his brother's intentions, and he ran away. He went to live with an uncle, and he was there for some 20 years. During which time he married Leah and then her sister Rachel, who was his favorite wife. And he had a bunch of sons. Jacob became very wealthy, and he wore out his welcome with his extended family. And God said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." And God better be with him, because he's going back to where Esau is, who had vowed to kill him. So Jacob obeyed the Lord. He got together all his family, all his servants, all his possessions, his herds, everything he had, and he headed for home. And here's what happened. Jacob looked up And there was Esau coming with his 400 men, a small army. And you know the first thought in Jacob's mind is, I am dead. He divided his children among Leah, Rachel, and his 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children, who had been fathered by Jacob, in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel, his favorite wife, and Joseph, the only one of his 11 sons mentioned by name. Rachel and Joseph in the rear, that is, at the rear of the caravan. Jacob placed himself at the front of this mass of people and animals, and as he neared his brother Esau, he bowed to the ground 7 times. And Esau, the text says, ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around him, around his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. Now that's not what Jacob expected to happen. And then we read this. Esau looked up and saw all the women and the children and said, Who are these with you? And Jacob said, These are the children God has graciously given your servant. And then the female servants and their children came and bowed down. And next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. And last of all came Joseph, only one mentioned, and Rachel. And they too bowed down. And there they are, all of them, bowing down to the one who held their very lives in his hand. This is a story about family. A story that Joseph remembered and heard again and again. A story about the day his uncle Esau did not do to his brother what he deserved, and how there had been a reconciliation that no one had expected, and that's why Joseph was alive. And now Joseph's scoundrel brothers are bowed before him, their lives in his hand. And he remembers the story. And in a moment of extraordinarily conflicting emotion, Joseph chooses to do what had been done for him so many years before, and he extends mercy to his brothers who deserved no mercy. Now, to make a long story just a bit shorter, eventually Joseph says to his brothers, I may walk like an Egyptian and talk like an Egyptian, but underneath all this Egyptian garb, I'm Hebrew and your brother. And what you intended for evil, God has used for all our good. And they all had a big group hug that only family can have. And they wept. What your children, your family, your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, what your family sees you do, especially in difficult times, will influence what they do when they are faced with similar circumstances in their own lives. What you experience and how you respond, how you react to those difficult times is part of that story that is passed along that shapes the lives of the next generation. Because see, the impact of your words doesn't end when the sound fades away. And your actions don't lose their significance when the deed has been done. If I had never had the opportunity to be around my grandchildren, I would still have an impact on their lives because my children are who they are, at least in part because of me. I think about the age of my grandchildren, so I really don't, and maybe the Lord will bless me to be able to, but I really don't expect to see my great-grandchildren in this life. But I know that my story will impact their lives. And I want that story to be a good story.